Good morning, Kevin Miller here, KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. We so appreciate you joining us here. Joining us now, the author of The Spy Who Was Left Behind, Michael Pollara. Good to have you back, sir.
Thank you, Kevin. It is good to be talking to you again.
You know, we talk about the Cold War and the post-Cold War world that you so personally detail in your book. Can you tell us a little about how that world was different than the world we live in today? We hear so much about Russian interference, but what was it like in the Soviet or the quickly breaking up Soviet world?
The world was divided into two camps, and interaction between those two camps was strictly controlled. There were specific locations in the world where you could go and you would see Russians interacting with Americans and others, but we did not have American involvement in our culture, in our economy. They were not actively engaged in buying and selling and laundering their money through our economy. We were not actively engaged in transferring technology to them and developing their resources and their ability to alter the markets in minerals and oil and gas. So what had happened was we built two completely separate structures that grew up with two completely different kinds of education systems and philosophy. And it impacted everything from medicine to education, sport, military. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it created a vacuum on both sides of the wall that sucked into the other side what had been missing. And so one of the very first things to be sucked across the border was one of the most efficient organizations inside the Soviet Union, the Russian Mafia. And they were one of the main beneficiaries of what we now call globalization. And the Russians went everywhere, organizing crime and developing trade. They were the original capitalists in Russia and some of the most successful in the world.
So let's talk a little bit about you. How did you become involved with the Russian mob, with the KGB, and with Putin?
Well, I got involved with them through this project. When the wall came down, I was fascinated to watch the changes that were going on. And so what I chose to do was put my life in storage, and together with a companion, went traveling through the Eastern Bloc for about 9 months. I traveled over by freighter and then hitchhiked, rode trains, rode buses, rode carts everywhere in a world that no longer exists. It was sort of like people coming off of a 70-year drunk, staggering around in shoes that hurt their feet. And I got to see them and see the life that they had been living and experience their recognition of the life that they might live in the future. I made lots of friends and found my way over into Russia, making more friends. And so when Freddie Woodruff was murdered a couple of years after I came back, I then turned back to the Soviet Union as a place I had been to before. And I went back there knowing that the story of Freddie Woodruff's execution and the very prompt justice that was meted out for it was something that was absolutely untrue, because it wasn't the kind of thing that happened in that world that I had seen. When Freddie was executed and I was engaged by the family to go and get the young man wrongfully convicted of that murder out of prison, that naturally led to the people who had both investigated the crime and the people who had perpetrated the crime. And there was no other group that I could deal with other than the former KGB, the former GRU, and the Mafia, because they were the people involved in this murder.
Well, who was Freddie Woodruff to you?
You know, Freddie was the oldest son of George Woodruff. George and Dorothy were the parents of Freddie and 3 girls. And George had been a house. Freddie was a heroic figure in the conservative world that I had grown up in. It was a small Bible college, and he played football there and was a Bible major. And I watched Freddie Woodruff play football. Now, he was older than me. I was a little junior high student, and he was a college football player, and so was sort of larger than life. But I knew him, and I followed him as the years went by. I had always heard he'd gone to work for the State Department. And so when the newspaper reported that the branch chief for Transcaucasia had been murdered and that his name was Freddie Woodruff, I was as surprised as anybody to discover that Freddie was a spy. But the family was still close to me. These were people that I still cared about. And so I set about to try and find out what the details of that murder were, hoping that I could provide them some comfort. And one thing led to another, and I discovered that the young man convicted of that murder was innocent. And so the family, holding true to the values that they had lived all their lives, said it is wrong for our tragedy to be visited on an innocent boy. And so they engaged me to go and get that fella out of jail. So who was Freddie to me? Freddie was a heroic figure when I was growing up, and he remained a hero all the way through my investigation.
Michael Polero joining us, Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM, talking about his bestseller, The Spy Who Was Left Behind. So it's easier said than done, I would imagine, to go into a world that was crumbling yet rebuilding itself, trying to find its own rules in the post-Soviet world. I'm trying to think of, was Yeltsin running the thing back then?
Yeah, Yeltsin was the president of Russia, but it was difficult to say that he was running things. Imagine, if you will, that tonight the government of the United States disappears and the courts are closed. There's no money to fund the police, and nothing that the government provides, from post office to tax collection all the way to the Parks Service, is going to operate tomorrow. What happens? Well, if you've got an agency that has the ability to provide a valuable service, perhaps the police or the intelligence services or even the military, you do everything in your power to try and find a way to fund that until such time as the government reestablishes itself. And what happened in Russia was that Mr. Gorbachev announced about 4 months before the Soviet Union collapsed that it would be disintegrating, that they would decide to end it and the individual constituent states would be independent. About a week later, the heads of the intelligence services and the military met together, and they divided up the drug trade. And their goal was not to sell drugs in particular. Their goal was to generate cash so that they would be able to continue to function as agencies that provided a service. And then they went into the new economy and they offered, in exchange for money, to provide those services to the new businessmen. And in coordination with the mafia, they provided judicial services, they provided police protection, they provided business intelligence information, and you could literally pay them to provide you government service. And the amount of money you had to pay them was lower than the tax rates we have to pay in the West. And you got really good service. And so these agencies were continuing to function at a very high level while everything else collapsed. And it was they who carried forward the Russian state that Yeltsin was the administrative head of, but not truly in control of.
Sounds like a very dangerous place to visit or to live.
It was a very dangerous place. You know, Kevin, one of the things that I remember most vividly was being on the streets of Moscow and feeling a pent-up rage, the possibility of explosive violence at any moment. And it wasn't any particular person. It was everybody was ready to fight, and everybody was afraid. The first times that I went over to Tbilisi, which is in the Republic of Georgia, and the location where Freddie was murdered, the lights didn't work at night. There wasn't gas flowing through to the meters. People didn't have hot water or heat in the winter. It seemed like just about everybody had a gun, and they weren't out to try and rob me or anybody else. They were afraid of each other. And it was dangerous because when people feel like their families are at risk, they'll do almost anything to protect them.
Michael Polero joining us, the spy who was left behind, Russia, the United States, and the true story of the betrayal and assassination of a CIA agent. Kevin Miller with you here, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Okay, here's a dumb question. Were you scared?
It's not a dumb question, Kevin. It's a really good question, and it's not an easy question to answer. I can tell you that there were a couple of times when people pulled guns on me, and I found that it really centered my attention very quickly. And during the event, I wasn't afraid. Afterwards, I was terrified. And so I came to understand that it really does bring you right into the moment. And when you're in the moment, there isn't any fear. There's only attention to every detail so that you know not to do something. At one point, one of the people who I believe was involved in arranging Freddie's murder became very angry at me, and he set about to try and kill me. And the FBI came and rushed me out of the country so that I would not become his victim. At that moment, I wasn't afraid. I was mostly annoyed. But as soon as I was on the airplane for the West, I suddenly realized what I was dealing with, and I became fearful. But you have a choice at that moment, Kevin. You decide, am I going to let my fear control me, or am I just going to address the fear and try and plan around it so that I avoid this guy, so that I don't go into that particular part of the country and give him an opportunity to do those things? And, you know, as my mama used to say to me, everybody dies, but not everybody lives. And so I chose to try and find ways to be safe and to do my job and to honor Freddie Woodruff. Because Freddie Woodruff was a hero. He died a hero because he had been recognized by our enemies as an implacable foe who could do them great injury. And they killed him because of it.
More coming up with best-selling author Michael Polero. You need to check out his book. It is fascinating. The Spy Who Was Left Behind. You're listening to Kevin Miller on 107.5 FM, 580 AM, KIDO Talk Radio. And good to have you with us. Welcome back, everybody. Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio. Michael Polero with us. The Spy Who Was Left Behind, the story of Freddie Woodruff, and Michael's, well, daring, brilliant, death-defying quest to find justice in this case. When we speak about Freddie Woodruff, and you remember him, he was in college, you were a little kid, he was a role model and such. Why do these folks go into the CIA or the FBI or the NSA when they know, and we read about it in the movies, Michael, you lived it, that their government just disavows them, or am I off base here?
You're not off base at all. One of the things that was most surprising and most satisfying about the work that I got to do was my interaction with the professionals in our intelligence agencies and in our law enforcement agencies like the FBI. These men and women are people of the highest caliber, people who have extraordinary training and fantastic abilities and who are incredibly disciplined. And they understand that we live in a very, very dangerous world. And that if we are going to protect our freedoms and protect our loved ones, somebody has to be on the wall, standing against our foes. And these courageous people choose to be that person. Freddie Woodruff understood that if he got in trouble, nobody was coming to help him. If he was killed, no one would come to avenge him. He would get an anonymous star on a marble wall in CIA headquarters, and only the most intimately involved would know his name. He would be forgotten and left behind. But he chose to live that life, to take those risks, so that, Kevin, you and I can live a life where we don't even have to think about those things. Those people are special, and I think they deserve to be honored.
Now, you're a pretty high-profile attorney. What was it like going from the American courtroom to the Russian courtroom or the Soviet courtroom?
Well, the courtroom work I did was in Georgia, and so it was modeled on both the Soviet system and the Georgian experiment, as they were trying to define for themselves what it would be like. It was really pretty difficult for me because I walked into the courtroom, and because I saw things that looked familiar, I assumed that the conduct of justice in that room would be somehow similar to the conduct of justice in an American courtroom. It's an amateur's mistake. It's the kind of thing that a tourist does when they go out of the country for the first time. It was startling to me to discover the extent to which inside the Soviet Union they used familiar forms almost for the sole purpose of convincing the West that they too provided and dispensed justice as we understand the concept. But a judge is not a judge in Georgia, at least not at this time. A judge was a person who supervised the lawyers in the courtroom and then retired to their chambers and waited for a telephone call from the president's office and would be told how to rule in that specific case. And it was true in my case, and it was true in all the other cases. The judge was not independent. The judge was not unbiased. The judge was not always fair. And so the appearance of justice is there, but the substance of justice was not.
Michael Polaro joining us. More coming up next. Kevin Miller in the morning, KIDO Talk Radio, traffic and weather together. Let's get you to work safely and on time. Good morning, Dave. And welcome back here, 107.5 FM, 580 AM, KIDO Talk Radio. Kevin Miller in the morning with the author of The Spy Who Was Left Behind. So you're learning as you're going here. On one hand, you're trying to clear a man convicted of the murder of your friend, and yet you're going up against the immense power of the state.
The immense power of a couple of states.
Yeah.
The Georgians at that time were completely beholden to the United States. They existed and continued to have independence from Russia only because the United States and Europe were funding them. And if the United States and Europe ceased to fund them, they would disappear. If the United States and Europe told them, don't let this young man who's in prison go free simply because he's innocent, then, in fact, they didn't do that. They refused to let him go, even though they readily acknowledged to me, of course he's innocent. We know he's innocent. But the United States did not want him to be free. And the reason for that was one of the things that I had to discover in order to get to a place where I could compel the Georgians and the Americans to let the young man go. there was a moment when it was no longer my task to prove that the young man was innocent. It was my task to identify who had murdered Freddie Woodruff, why they murdered him, who hired that person to murder Freddie Woodruff, and why the Americans and Georgians would be complicit in covering up that murder. I had to do that in order to get to a place in which the Americans and the Georgians would acknowledge it was in their best interest to let the young man go. And that's the place that I ultimately got to, and that's the story that's in the book.
Indeed. Michael, please hang on. We're going to hear more from Michael Polero next. You're listening to Kevin Miller on KIDO Talk Radio. Good morning, Maggie. 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Kevin Miller in the morning, living the dream. The Spy Who Was Left Behind, available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, just about anywhere. Michael Polero joining us to talk about his real-life crusade to clear an innocent man of a crime of murder, of the 1993 murder of CIA officer Freddie Woodruff. Michael, before, and a lot of people, they come in and out, they might not have known some of your real-world experience, and I've got to ask you again, and we've got a longer time here for this segment, what was it like to interview real-life assassins?
That's a good question. You know, my first thought when I was presented with the opportunity to actually talk to people as a matter of their profession were killers was to feel morally superior and to think that I would go into this and be able to communicate some level of my superiority and their inferiority, and therefore I would come away from the experience confirmed. But the truth was that these are, by and large, professionals. There are people who, at least at one point in their career, were patriots and became entrepreneurs. There are people who were forced into this life either by circumstances beyond their control or by a series of incremental decisions, such as joining the military and then moving into an elite unit and then becoming specialized and then becoming a sniper and then becoming a killer. Marina Capanazza, the woman who was sitting in the back seat of the car next to Freddie, was actually a very pleasant young woman, very pretty. And one day, when she was about 19 years old, she was at home and the police arrested her brother, sent a message to her father, and said, "We've arrested your son. Send Marina to pick him up." And Marina, who was a linguist, she could speak English and German and Russian and Georgian. Marina was told, "You will work for us or we will kill your brother." And when I came to understand this kind of history that these people had lived through, I stopped feeling superior and started feeling something akin to compassion. And when I began to understand the professionalism that they tried to bring to their lives, I was not directly afraid of them because unless someone paid them, they wouldn't kill me. They were professionals. And so it was a completely unexpected evolution of what it feels like to talk to a killer.
I still go back to that, we see it in the movies or read it in the books. People that are paid to professionally kill, like you're paid to be a lawyer or to be a writer or to be a bricklayer.
Correct. There are people who provide this service. In fact, the man who I believe killed Freddie had a company resume that he had printed up. And on the company resume, he touted the fact that his organization had killed the American CIA officer in Georgia. And he took that resume and he went to another government right there in Transcaucasia and walked into the office of the Minister of Interior, which to us would be sort of CIA and FBI combined, and offered to do murder at the cut rate price of $1,000 a bullet. The reason that the price was so low was because the market had been flooded with killers because the Soviet Union had collapsed. And a lot of guys who really had excellent skills were out of work and needed a job.
The Spy Who Was Left Behind, Kevin Miller with the author Michael Pallera, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. What was the scariest moment for you there?
Oh, that's easy. On the first anniversary of the Rose Revolution, Misha Saakashvili, the American-trained lawyer who had unseated the former Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, he was giving a speech at the Polytechnic University. It was an invitation-only crowd. There were about 1,500 people there, and supposedly nobody who didn't have an invitation could get in, but I was an American, and two Americans who were invited and were supposed to be speakers had brought me with them. And so I walked in and was sitting on the second row listening to the president's speech. It was carried live on national television, and when he finished, he felt really comfortable with the crowd because they were very, very favorably disposed toward him and applauded at all the right moments. And he threw it open to questions. And the first question that he got was from a fellow who stood up, took the microphone, and said, "Please tell us what wonders you will do in the second year of your presidency to match the extraordinary miracles you worked in the first year." And everyone applauded, and he blushed a little and talked about what he intended to do. Then they handed me the mic. And I stood up with my interpreter and started talking to him about the murder of Freddie Woodruff and the innocent young Georgian man who was in jail. And he was furious, felt ambushed, angry. And his guards triangulated around me and pulled out their guns. And I thought, not that I had killed myself, I thought I had killed the young man in prison. Because the whole thing could have gone away in an instant if someone had walked over there and killed him. And I couldn't eat for a week. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever encountered because I thought I had killed someone else.
And you weren't worried about yourself, even though the people surrounded you with the guns.
It really wasn't. You know, it's this. I had this at that moment. I'm not so foolish today, but at that moment I thought, I'm an American. No one can do anything to me. It wasn't true, of course, but I didn't know better. I learned later that I needed to be more careful. I was more careful, but at that moment, my worry was on somebody else, not on myself.
So what about the young man that was falsely convicted? What did you learn about him, Michael?
You know, Kevin, it's very interesting. He was a very simple guy. He had a sixth-grade education. He wasn't a particularly nice fella. He was a laborer when he was out of prison. He would odd jobs. I actually went up into the mountains and visited with his mother and his brother in their home, a small, very humble structure on the side of what would be an alpine mountain. Spectacular beauty all around, except for the little hovel in which they lived. And he was not a particularly pleasant fellow. After I got him out of prison, I got word that he wanted to call and talk to me, and actually I expected sort of gushing gratitude and was trying to figure out how I would navigate that, he called, and through his wife, who spoke some English, he growled at me and said, "You need to give me money. Saved my life. Now you have to help me live it." And on balance, I thought that was a pretty rational response to something as crazy as my having come halfway around the world to get him out of jail. But it wasn't exactly the kind of response that you'd expect from a really nice.
Well, wouldn't that highlight the differences between the, for lack of a better term, the Georgian or Soviet-style, Russian-style thinking and those of the West? Many people misrepresent that they have the same values that we do.
I'm not sure, Kevin. I've dealt with a lot of people in pro bono cases that I've done here in the States that have pretty much the same attitude, that they feel like that the system has been so unfair to them that when the system finally treats them right and does what it should have done in the first place, they're not particularly grateful because all they've ever gotten is exactly what they were entitled to in the first place. And that makes a lot of sense to me, particularly when you're dealing with people who don't really understand how the system works in the first place. I can tell you from firsthand experience that when you want to talk about people who are hospitable and gracious and embracing, the Georgians are just about the best people in the world in how they treat strangers. They say that Georgian hospitality is like a very affectionate mugging. They bring you in, and they're so nice to you, they simply won't let you go. And that was my experience with these people. People of great values, people with absolutely incredible intellects and well-developed moral and ethical codes. But like America, you have all kinds of people. And the big difference between us and them is that we have community structures that allow us to basically create better lives for ourselves than they have. Their community structures are based mostly on clan, family, religion, and language. And each of these groups, as it gets smaller, competes with every other group around it. But I don't think that we are superior to them. We just had so many blessings, advantages secured for us by the heroes like Freddie Woodruff. And that's why people want what we have.
The spy who was left behind, Michael Polaro. One more segment with him. You're listening to Kevin Miller on KIDO Talk Radio, 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Coming up next, much, much more. Stay with us. KIDO Talk Radio. And appreciate you joining us here in beautiful Idaho. Kevin Miller in the morning. Mike Polaro joining us. The Spy Who Was Left Behind. Michael, you've written this book, but you go back to the early 90s and how it's different from the world we live in today, and any reflections?
On how it's different?
Well, you're right, sir. It's, again, let me be, Russia this, Russia that. You were there. You know those folks, and you worked in, Georgia, this emerging republic, if you will, or government or country, dependent on the West. As you were writing this book, how reflective were you on your experience?
One of the things that was interesting about the time in which I was writing the book, and it started roughly around 2014, right, was that Mr. Putin had risen to the top of the Soviet Union, a former KGB officer, call any KGB officer former. You have the interference in our election. You have the murder of dissidents. You have the use of the judicial system to punish anyone who is politically opposed. And what I came to understand was that all the little things that I had noticed in microcosm in Georgia have become writ large in Russia as a general rule. And the same people who were busy trying to defeat Freddie Woodruff, trying to defeat the Americans in Georgia, are the same people who are trying to defeat our democracy and trying to interfere in our economy, our judicial system, and in our community and the communal spirit of the United States. And one of the things that it made me understand, Kevin, was that we created NATO, we created the CIA to fight with the Soviet Union and to protect us from the threat of the Soviet Union. But the truth of the matter is we don't need protection from the Soviet Union anymore. We need protection from the Russians because the Soviet Union was Russian. The Russian Empire was Russian. Mr. Putin's Russia is Russian. And we need protection from them because they're Russians. It's in their nature to do the things that they are doing now. It's a different flag. It's the same anthem. It's a different face representing Russia, but it is the same competitive spirit and desire to dominate. The Russians are not as strong as the United States. They recognize this. I was told this several times by officers of the KGB. But they want to make America shorter so that they appear taller. And that's what I came to understand about our friends.
Michael Polero joining us, the spy who was left behind. Kevin Miller in the morning, traffic and weather together. Let's get you to work safely and on time. 107.5 FM, 580 AM. Good morning, Dave. And just a little under 4 minutes left with Michael Polero. Michael, let's go back to the Woodruff family. What has been their reaction to the writing of this book?
It's when you ask about the Woodruff family, there are really two separate groups to consider. One is the nuclear family that I grew up with. The second is the family that Freddie himself created. And of the nuclear family, I think that George and Dorothy died before I was able to finish my work. And they had prayed every night for the young man who was in prison because they had been afraid from the very beginning that he was innocent. The sisters who survived Freddie were also very pious, religious people. And they feel like they have fulfilled the mandate of the Good Samaritan. They looked out at the world and said, who is my neighbor? And it happened to be Anzor Sharmaidze, a mountain boy with a sixth grade education who they got out of prison. Freddie's family, his widow, was a former CIA officer herself, and she was very careful to avoid any involvement in my work because I think she was afraid that I might embarrass or somehow create negative publicity for the CIA. And if I did that, I am so sorry that might happen because I have nothing but respect for the agency and the heroes that serve us through. His children, the ones that I have met, I'm happy to say that my work opened their eyes and helped them redefine who their father was. That they came to understand that he wasn't a guy in a foreign country killed by a drunk. He was a soldier for freedom who was murdered by an enemy as he was doing, and he died a hero.
Michael, any final thoughts in the minute that we have left, sir?
Well, Kevin, the thing that I'm most enthusiastic about coming out of this experience is the fact that one person can actually accomplish something in the world. I've been so concerned as I've watched America Americans fight with each other, and we seem to think that the only thing we can do is either tweet or like. And the truth of the matter is we have enormous freedoms and opportunities that the world has never seen before. And little children used to ask, Daddy, what did you do in the war? I want to ask people, what have you done with your freedom? You have it. What have you done with it? Because if you find something that you're passionate about, something you care about, you can step onto the world stage and you can change the world. That's what this whole story is about.
Michael Polero, we appreciate you. We urge folks to go Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and thank you again for joining us. We appreciate your patience, sir.
Delighted to talk to you, Kevin.
You're listening to Kevin Miller on KIDO Talk Radio.